Hey everybody, how's it going? Are you using the internet at all, dear, on TV? Okay, good. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to Little House Live, day 35. I think I got a bit of sunburn yesterday. I'm really in a lot of, it was really difficult to sleep last night. How's everybody doing? Hi, Pam. Hi, Anne. We're just going to start without people in a minute. I would, if I can. How many chapters do we got? 22. And what's the last chapter? 26. Do you think we could do 4 today? We'll see. Okay. We'll see how I'm doing. But I also have to do I'm sorry, folks. I had a really bad night. We have to do Life with the Wolfies live at 4. So, and Pam, Marie, how's it going? All right, here we go. Maybe we can make it through 4 chapters. We'll see. Because what's going to happen is when I finish this book, I'm going to move from this right on to Grandy's gift. And I think we're going to do Grandy's gift live. What do you think? I need your, because we're going to take a break from Little House on the Prairie to do Grandy's gift. But rather than pre-recording, let me know if you'd rather have it pre-recorded or if you'd rather have it live. Okay, just let me know. And then we'll decide from there. Hey, Marie. All right. I'm trying to see if that light's enough. You know what? I don't even need that light today. It's this new camera. Doesn't need and the overhead light in my desk. Hey, Helen 22. Happy Sunday. And the one in the top of my desk here usually overshadows my webcam, but I have a new webcam. As you can see my whole messy office. What's that? Howie's doing the main floor cleaning. Oh my goodness! Pine cones. All right, well, we'll find something to do with them at Christmas. All right. Live. Well, let's see how many votes we get for live or recorded. Live is easier for me. Uh-oh. You can't jump up on me, baby. Mommy got sunburn. Yeah, good girl. Look at where she put her paws. Oh my, easy. Oh my goodness. Oh my baby. She was so good yesterday. She let people pet her. Yes. But everybody who came near her asked first. And that's all she asks is, don't just walk up to me. I'm not that sociable. But she was very nice yesterday. And watch Mommy's sunburn. Can I have a little kiss? Easy. Oh, there's your mommy. Oh, I know what you need. That's right. You got skin itchies. This one. It'll help the itchies, Gracie. Don't matter what Daddy's doing. Yes, and you can have one more. You can have one more. There you go. Go see what Daddy's doing. I didn't get a kiss, though. All right. Hi. I will go by the comments to find out whether, I'm it's not the lighting. I am really red. I'll go in the comments before, during, and after this video to let me know if you want me to do Grandy's gift live. If so, I've got to read it in bed tonight. So I don't have to read it in bed tonight. I want to read it. It's going to be my reading tonight. Chapter 22, Prairie Fire. Spring had come. The warm winds smelled exciting, and all outdoors was large and bright and sweet. I'm not kidding, folks. This bottle just moved by itself. It just moved forward like a half an inch. Nothing like telling me to take my supplements, eh? CalMag, zinc. CalMag D3. Oh, well, thank you. I made it. And I plan on making more. All right. Prairie Fire, Chapter 22. The things on my desk stay still. The warm wind smelled exciting, and all outdoors was large and bright and sweet. Big white shining clouds floated high up in clear space. Their shadows floated over the prairie. The shadows were thin and brown, and all the rest of the prairie was the pale, soft colors of dead grasses. Pa was breaking the prairie sod, with Pet and Patty hitched to the breaking plow. The sod was a tough, thick mass of grass roots. Pet and Patty slowly pulled with all their might, and the sharp plow slowly turned over a long, unbroken strip of sod. The dead grass was so tall and thick that it held up the sod. So when he turned it away, it didn't lay flat. It kind of stood up. Where Pa had plowed, he didn't have a plowed field. The long strip of grass roots lay on top of the grass, and the grass stuck out between them. But Pa, Pet, and Patty kept on working. He said that sod potatoes and sod corn would grow this year, and next year the roots in the dead grasses would be rotted. In 2 or 3 years, he would have nicely plowed fields. Pa liked the land because it was so rich, and there wasn't a tree or stump or rock in it. Now, a great many Indians came riding along the Indian Trail. Indians were everywhere. Their guns echoed in the creek bottoms where they were hunting. No one knew how many Indians were hidden in the prairie, which seemed so level but wasn't. Often, Laura saw an Indian where no one had been an instant before. Indians often came to the house. Some were friendly, some were surly and cross. All of them wanted food and tobacco. Ma gave them what they wanted. She was afraid not to. When an Indian pointed at something and grunted, Ma gave him that thing. But most of the food was kept hidden and locked up. Jack was cross all the time, even with Laura. He was never let off the chain, and all the time he lay and hated the Indians. Laura and Mary were quite used to seeing them now. Indians didn't surprise them at all, but they always felt safer near Pa or Jack. One day they were helping Ma get dinner. Baby Carrie was playing on the floor in the sunshine, and suddenly the sunshine was gone. I do believe it's going to storm, Ma said, looking out the window. Laura looked too, and great black clouds were billowing up in the south across the sun. Pet and Patty were coming running from the field, Pa holding to the heavy plow and bounding in long leaps behind it. Prairie fire, he shouted. Get the tub full of water and put sacks in it. Hurry. Ma ran to the well. Laura ran to tug the tub to it. Pa tied Jack to the house. He brought the cow and the calf from the picket line and shut them in the stable. He caught Bunny and tied her fast to the north corner of the house. Ma was pulling up buckets of water as fast as she could. Laura ran to get the sacks Pa had flung out of the stable. Pa was now, back then, remember, sacks were made of cloth or burlap, right? Pa was plowing and shouting at Pet and Patty to make them hurry. The sun was nearly black. The sky was black now. The air was as dark as if the sun had set. Pa plowed a long furrow west of the house and south of the house and back again east of the house. Rabbits came bounding past him as if he wasn't there. Pet and Patty came galloping, the plow and Pa bounding behind them. Pa tied them to the north corner of the house. The tub was full of water. Laura helped Ma push the sacks under the water to soak them. I couldn't plow but one furrow. There isn't time, Pa said. Hurry, Caroline, that fire's coming faster than a horse can run. A big rabbit bounded right over the tub while Pa and Ma were lifting it. Ma told Laura to stay at the house. Pa and Ma ran staggering to the furrow with the tub. Laura stayed close to the house. She could see the red fire coming under the billows of smoke. More rabbits went leaping by. They paid no attention to Jack, and he didn't think about them. He stared at the red under the skies of the rolling smoke and shivered and whined while he crowded close to Laura. The wind was rising and wildly screaming. Thousands of birds flew before the fire. Thousands of rabbits were running. Pa was going along the furrow, setting fire to the grass on the other side of it. Ma followed with a wet sack, beating at the flames that tried to cross the furrow. The whole prairie was hopping with rabbits. Snakes rippled across the yard. Prairie hens ran silently, their necks outstretched and their wings spread. Birds screamed in the screaming wind. Pa's little fire was all around the house now, and he helped Ma fight it with the wet sacks. The fire blew wildly, snatching at the dry grass inside the furrow. Pa and Ma thrashed at it with sacks, and when it got across the furrow, they stamped it with their feet. They ran back and forth in the smoke, fighting that fire. The prairie fire was roaring now, roaring louder and louder in the screaming wind. Great flames came roaring, flaring, and twisting high. Twists of flame broke loose and came down on the wind to blaze up in the grasses far ahead of the roaring firewall. A red light came from the rolling black clouds of smoke overhead, and their hands trembled. I want you to remember this scene because there was one in on the banks of Plum Creek that I think is where she got the details for how this was handled. Because remember, this one's fiction. Well, it's mostly fiction. It's hearsay of what Laura's heard as her parents talk, because she was only 18 months old when they were actually there. I actually think that her mom was pregnant with Carrie. Or her mom was pregnant with Carrie, not Grace, in this one, I think. Or at this period in time. Mary and Laura stood against the house and held hands and trembled. Baby Carrie was in the house. Laura wanted to do something, but inside her head was a roaring and whirling like the fire. Her middle shook and tears poured out of her stinging eyes. Her eyes and nose and her throat stung with smoke. Jack howled. Bunny and Petty and Patty. Baby Carrie was in the house. Bunny and Petty and Patty were jerking at the ropes and squealing horribly. The orange, yellow, terrible flames were coming faster than the horses can run, and their quivering light danced over everything. Pa's little fire had made a burned black strip. The little fire went backwards slowly away against the wind. It went slowly crawling to meet the racing, furious big fire. And then suddenly the big fire swallowed the little one. The wind rose to a high, crackling, rushing shriek. Flames climbed into the crackling air. Fire was all around the house. And then it was over. The fire went roaring past and away. Pa and Ma were beating out little fires here and there in the yard. When they were all out, Ma came to the house to wash her hands and face. She was all streaked with smoke and sweat, and she was trembling. She said there was nothing to worry about. The backfire saved us, she said, and all's well that ends well. The air smelled scorched, and to the very edge of the sky, the prairie was burned naked and black. Threads of smoke rose from it. Ashes blew on the wind. Everything felt different and miserable. But Pa and Ma were cheerful because the fire was gone and had not done any harm. The fire was gone and it had not done any harm. Sorry. Pa said that the fire had not missed them by far, but a miss was as good as a mile. He asked Ma, if it had come while I was in Independence, what would you have done? We would have gone to the creek with the birds and the rabbits, of course. All the wild things on the prairie had known what to do. They ran and flew and hopped and crawled as fast as they could go to the water that would keep them safe from fire. Only the little soft striped gophers, had gone down deep into their holes, and they were the first to come up and look around the bare, smoking prairie. Then out of the creek bottoms the birds came flying over it, and a rabbit cautiously hopped and looked. It was a long, long time before the snakes crawled out of the bottoms and the prairie hens came walking. The fire had gone out among the bluffs. It had never reached the creek bottoms or the Indian camps. That night, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Scott came by to see Pa. They were worried because they thought perhaps the Indians had started the fire on purpose to burn out the white settlers. Pa didn't believe it. He said the Indians always burned the prairie over to make green grass grow more quickly and traveling easier. Their ponies couldn't gallop through the thick, tall, dead grass. Now the ground was clear, and he was glad of it because plowing would be easier. While they were talking, they could hear the drums beating in the Indian camps and shouts. Laura sat still as a mouse on the doorstep and listened to the talk and to the Indians. The stars hung low and large and quivering over the burned prairie, and the wind blew gently in Laura's hair. Mr. Edwards said that there were too many Indians in those camps. He didn't like it. Mr. Scott said he didn't know why so many of those savages were coming together if they didn't mean devilment. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, Mr. Scott said. Sorry, folks, that just went right down my back and out my bloodline. Pa said he didn't know about that. He figured that Indians would be as peaceable as anybody else if they were let alone. Okay, let's say that again and let's have a little bit of a talk here. Pa said he didn't know about that. He figured that Indians would be peaceable as anybody else if they were let alone. So why did he move into Indian territory? The land hadn't been cleared for settlement yet. And that wasn't leaving them alone, was it? It was walking right into their living room and setting up camp is what that was. Okay, Pam. On the other hand, they had been moved west so many times. Thank you. On the other hand, they had been moved west so many times that they naturally hated white folks. But an Indian ought to have sense enough to know when he was licked. With soldiers at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge, Pa didn't believe these Indians would make any trouble. As to why they're congregating in these camps, Scott, I can tell you that. They're getting ready for their big spring buffalo hunt. Now, how the hell would he know that? Or is he just making talk? They're sworn to peace among themselves, he said, and they're thinking about hunting the buffalo. So it's not likely they'll start on the warpath against us. They'll have their talks and their feasts, and then one day they'll all hit the trail after the buffalo herds. The buffalo will be working their way north pretty soon, following the green grass. By George, I'd like to go on a hunt like that myself. It must be a sight to see. Everything all right, dear? Thank you, darling. Well, maybe you're right about it, Ingalls, Mr. Scott said slowly. Anyway, I'll be glad to tell Mrs. Scott what you say. She can't get the Minnesota massacres out of her head. Chapter 23. Cry. The next morning, Pa went whistling to his plowing. He came in at noon, black with soot from the burned prairie, but he was pleased. The tall grass didn't bother him anymore, but there was an uneasiness about the Indians. More and more Indians were in the creek bottoms. Mary and Laura saw the smoke from their fires by day, and at night they heard the savage voices shouting. Pa came in early from the field. He did the chores early and shut Pet and Patty and Bunny and the cow and calf into the stable. They could not stay out in the yard to graze in the cool moonlight. When shadows began to gather on the prairie and the wind was quiet, the noises from the Indian camps grew louder and wilder. Pa brought Jack into the house. The door was shut and the latch string pulled in. No one could go outdoors till morning. Night crept towards the little house, and the darkness was frightening. It yelped with Indian yells, and one night it began to throb with Indian drums. In her sleep, Laura heard all the time that savage yipping and the wild throbbing drums. She heard Jack's claws clicking in his low growl. Sometimes Pa sat up in bed, listening. One evening, he took his bullet mold from the box under the bed. He sat a long time on the hearth, melting lead and making bullets. He did not stop till he had used the last bit of lead. Laura and Mary lay awake and watched him. He had never made so many bullets at one time before. Mary asked, "What makes you do that, Pa?" "Oh, I haven't anything else to do," Pa said, and he began to whistle cheerfully. But he had been plowing all day. He was too tired to play. He had been plowing all day, and he was too tired to play the fiddle. He might have gone to bed instead of sitting up so late making bullets. No more Indians came to the house. For days, Mary and Laura had not seen a single Indian. Mary did not like to go out of the house anymore. Laura had to play outdoors by herself, and she had a queer feeling about the prairie. It didn't feel safe. It seemed to be hiding something. Sometimes Laura had felt a feeling that something was watching her, something that was creeping up behind her. She turned around quickly, and nothing was there. Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards, with their guns, came and talked to Pa in the field. They talked quite a while, then they went away together. Laura was disappointed because Mr. Edwards did not come to the house. At dinner, Pa said to Ma that some of the settlers were talking about a stockade. Laura didn't know what a stockade was. Pa had told Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards that it was a foolish notion. He told Ma, "If we need one, we'd need it before we could get it built. And the last thing we want to do is act like we're afraid." Mary and Laura looked at each other. They knew it was no use to ask questions. They would only be told that children must not speak at the table until they were spoken to, or that children should be seen and not heard. Excuse me. Hey, Helen, how are you? That afternoon, Laura asked Ma what a stockade was. Ma said it was something to make little girls ask questions. That meant that grown-ups would not tell you what it was. And Mary looked at Laura and Mary looked a look at Laura that said, "I told you so." Laura didn't know why Pa said he must not act as if he was afraid. Pa was never afraid. Laura didn't want to act as if she was afraid, but she was. She was afraid of the Indians. See, all that not telling the children anything, they drew their own conclusions, and they could, they drew their own conclusions anyway, right? Not giving a child information when they're scared is even scarier. Okay, right? Jack never laid back his ears and smiled at Laura anymore, even while she petted him. His ears were lifted, his neck bristled, and his lips twitched back from his teeth. His eyes were angry. Every night he growled more fiercely, and every night the Indian drums beat faster and faster, and the wild yipping rose higher and higher, faster and wilder. In the middle of the night, Laura sat up and screamed. Some terrible sound had made cold sweat come out all over her. Ma came to her quickly and said in her gentle voice, "Be quiet, Laura. You mustn't frighten Carrie." Laura clung to Ma, and Ma was wearing her dress. The fire was covered with ashes, and the house was dark, but Ma had not gone to bed. Moonlight came through the window. The shutter was open, and Pa stood in the dark by the window looking out. He had his gun. Out in the night, the drums were beating, and the Indians were wildly yelling. Then that terrible sound came again. Laura felt as if she were falling, and she couldn't hold on to anything. There was nothing solid anywhere. It seemed a long time before she could see or think or speak. She screamed, What is it? What is it? Oh, Pa, what is it? She was shaking all over and felt sick in her middle. She heard the drums pounding and the wild yipping yells, and she felt Ma holding her. Pa said, "It's the Indian war cry, Laura." He explained to Ma made a soft sound, and he said to her, "They might as well know, Caroline." He explained to Laura that that was the Indian way of talking about war. The Indians were only talking about it and dancing around their fires. Mary and Laura must not be afraid because Pa was there and Jack was there, and the soldiers at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge were at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge. So don't be afraid, Mary and Laura, he said. Laura gasped and said, "No, Pa," but she was horribly afraid. Mary couldn't say anything. She lay shivering under the covers. Then Carrie began to cry, so Ma carried her to the rocking chair and gently rocked her. Laura crept out of bed and huddled against Ma's knee, and Mary, left all alone, crept after her and huddled close too. Pa stayed by the window watching. The drums seemed to beat in Laura's head. They seemed to beat deep inside her. The wild, fast, yipping yells were worse than wolves. Something worse was coming. Laura knew it, and then it came, the Indian war cry. A nightmare is not so terrible as that night was. A nightmare is only a dream, and when it's at its worst, you wake up. But this was real, and Laura could not wake up. She could not get away from it. When the war cry was over, Laura knew it had not got her yet. She was still in the dark house, and she was still pressed close to Ma, and Ma was trembling all over. Jack's growl ended in a sobbing growl. Jack's howling ended in a sobbing growl. Carrie began to scream again, and Pa wiped his forehead and said, "Whew! I've never heard anything like it," he said. He asked, "How do you suppose they learned to do it?" But nobody answered. "They don't need guns. That yell's enough to scare anybody to death," he said. "My mouth's so dry I couldn't whistle a tune to save my life. Bring me some water, Laura." That made Laura feel better because it gave her something to do. Made her feel like she was doing something, anything towards helping, right? She carried a dipper full of water to Pa at the window. He took it and smiled at her, and that made her feel very much better. He drank a little and smiled again. "There, now I can whistle." And he whistled a few notes to show her that he could. Then he listened, and Laura, too, heard far away the soft pitter-pat, pitter-pat, pitter-pat-pat of a pony's galloping, and it came nearer. From one side of the house came the drumming, throbbing, and the fast, shrill, yapping yells from the other side, and from the other side came the lonely rider galloping. Nearer and nearer it came. Now the hoofs clattered loudly, and suddenly they were going by. The galloping went by and fainter down the creek road. In the moonlight, Laura saw the behind of a little black Indian pony and an Indian on its back. She saw a huddle of blanket and a naked head and a flutter of feathers above it, and moonlight on a gun barrel, and then it was all gone. Nothing was there but empty prairie. Excuse me. Didn't mean to yawn. I had a really rough night. But the worst of the worst fibro flare is just about over, so I'm really happy about that. Pa said he was derned if he knew what to make of it. He said that was the Osage who had tried to talk French to him. He asked, "What's he doing out at this hour, riding hell-bent for leather?" Nobody asked because nobody knew. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The drums throbbed and the Indians went on yelling. The terrible war cry came again and again. Little by little, after a long time, the yells grew fainter and fewer. At last, Carrie cried herself to sleep. Ma sent Mary and Laurie back to bed. The next day, they could not go out of the house. Pa stayed close by. There was not one sound from the Indian camps. The whole vast prairie was still. Only the winds blew over the blackened earth where there was no grass to rustle. The wind blew past the house with a rushing sound like running water. That night, the noise in the Indian camps was worse than the night before. Again, the war cries were more terrible than the most dreadful nightmare. Laura and Mary huddled close again against Ma. Poor little baby Carrie cried. Pa watched at the window with his gun. All night long, Jack paced and growled and screamed when the war cries came. The next night and the next night and the next night were worse and worse. Mary and Laura were so tired that they fell asleep while the drums pounded and the Indians yelled. But a war cry always jerked them wide awake in terror. And the silent days were even worse than the nights. Pa watched and listened all the time. The plow was in the field where he had left it. Pet and Patty and the colt and cow and calf stayed in the barn. Ma and Laura could not go out of the house, and Pa never stopped looking at the prairie all around and turning his head quickly towards the smallest noise. He ate hardly any dinner. He kept getting up and going outdoors to look all around at the prairie. One day his head nodded down to the table and he slept there. Ma, and you're gonna recognize some of these. You're gonna recognize some of these moments in On the Banks of Plum Creek. Okay, just remember that. Remember the prairie fire, and remember Pa nodding to sleep on the table. He ate hardly any dinner. He kept going up and looking out the doors to look at all the prairie. One day his head nodded down to the table and he slept there. Ma and Mary and Laura were still to let him sleep. He was so tired, but in a minute he woke with a jump and said sharply to Ma, "Don't let me do that again." "Jack was on guard," Ma said gently. That night was the worst of all. The drums were faster, the yells were louder and fiercer. All up and down the creek, war cries answered war cries, and the bluffs echoed. There was no rest. Laura ached all over, and there was a terrible ache in her very middle. Like, think about 4 or 5 days of constant stress, not knowing whether you're going to live or die, or where it's going to come from, eh? At the window, Pa said, "Caroline, they're quarreling among themselves now. Maybe they will fight each other." "Oh, Charles, if they only will," said Ma. All night there was not a minute's rest. Just before dawn, a last war cry ended, and Laura slept against Ma's knee. She woke up in bed. Mary was sleeping beside her, and the door was open, and by the sunshine on the floor, Laura knew it was almost noon. Ma was cooking dinner, and Pa sat on the doorstep. He said to Ma, "There's another big party going off to the south." Laura went to the door in her nightgown, and she saw a long line of Indians far away. The line came up out of the black prairie, and it went farther away southward. The Indians on their ponies were so small in the distance that they looked not much bigger than ants. Pa said that 2 big parties of Indians had gone west that morning. Now this one was going south. It meant that the Indians had quarreled among themselves. They were going away from their camps in the creek bottoms. They would not go altogether to their big buffalo hunt. That night, the darkness came quietly. There was no sound except the rushing of the wind. "Tonight we'll sleep," Pa said, and they did. All that night long they did not even dream, and in the morning Jack was still sleeping limp and flat on the same spot where he had been sleeping when Laura went to bed. The next night was still too, and again they all slept soundly. That morning, Pa said he felt as fresh as a daisy, and he was going to do a little scouting along the creek. He chained Jack to the ring in the house wall, and he took his gun and went out of sight down the creek road. Laura and Mary and Ma could not do anything but wait until he came back. They stayed in the house and wished he would come. The sunshine had never moved so slowly on the floor as it did that day. But he did not come back. Late in the afternoon he came, and everything was all right. He had gone far up and down the creek and had seen many deserted Indian camps. All the Indians had gone. All the Indians had gone away except the tribe called the Osage. In the woods, Pa had met an Osage who could talk to him. This Indian told him that all the tribes except the Osages had made up their minds to kill the white people who had come into the Indian territory, Indian country. And they were getting ready to do it when the lone Indian came riding into their big powwow. That Indian, remember the one that had smoked and dinner and spoke French to Pa? That Indian had come riding so far and fast because he did not want them to kill the white people. He was an Osage, and they called him a name that meant he was a great soldier. Soldat de Chêne, Pa said was his name. He kept arguing with them day and night. Pa said till all the other Osages agreed with him. Then he stood up and told the other tribes that if they started to massacre us, the Osages would fight them. Osage. That was what had made so much noise that last terrible night. The other tribes were howling at the Osage, and the Osage were howling back at them. The other tribes did not dare to fight Soldat de Chêne and all his Osages. So the next day they went away. That's one good Indian, Pa said. No matter what Mr. Scott said, Pa did not believe that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. Hey, Ahmad, how's it going? My goodness, we got 13 people here. But you'll see in the next book, which is On the Banks of Plum Creek, that there were times when, he was so tired he would lay down and Mom would just tell everybody, he would do something, he'd nod off, and they would all just sit still and let him sleep. Because in those 4 or 5 days, he almost didn't sleep at all. It's amazing he didn't start seeing things. Think about the people stealing their land. Absolutely. You think if people came in and started parking their shit on my lawn, I wouldn't get upset? Bloody right I would. But the thing is the native people don't think like, now I don't want to say white man, because white is a color. It's not a heritage. It's just a color. White is a color, right? So I lost myself where I was going to talk to. But yeah, they talk about people stealing their land. Yeah, right? But the natives did not believe that land was ownable. It was a gift from the Great Spirit for all to use, not for people to walk up and tear up the land, because the native peoples lived one with the land. They didn't have to be told when to hunt and when not to hunt, right? Why? Because they hunted with the seasons of the animals. And when like in the fall, when they're all fattened up and ready for winter, you know what I mean? And they didn't, it was a long time before native people started becoming farmers and stuff. So they lived one with the land. And so for somebody foreign to move in and start cutting up the land and claiming it as theirs was totally foreign to them. It was like stealing, because the land, although they were like confused, like, you can't own the land. It belongs to everybody, right? So, and then the immigrants and the new landed people and generational people like me. Yeah, you know, I don't identify as white. I identify as, you know, Scots, English, Native, Canadian. But it's that big handle, right? So I just call myself Canadian, but I'm not a true Canadian. Well, I guess I am. I got Native blood, but I mean, I'm not a true Canadian in the sense where I was Native, right? So we have 24, 25. We have 3 more chapters. Do you want to read them? What time is it? I have to do my live at 4, so please excuse me. Excuse me. Now, do we want to read another chapter? Howie, did you get the meat out of the little freezer? Could you get it out so I can marinate it? All right. I mean, we could learn a lot, right? We could learn a lot, but the truth is, right back to the Vikings, okay? We're land grabbers, always have been, right? Oh yeah, and I have Viking. I mean, which means the Scottish and the English and all that stuff is, you know. Anyway, chapter 24. It would be nice. There's not much here. It would be nice if we could finish the book today, right? Are y'all with me? Chapter 24. The Indians ride away. There was another long night of sleep. It was so good to lie down and sleep soundly. Everything was safe. Only the owls called hoo, hoo in the woods along the creek, while the great moon sailed slowly over the curve of the sky above the endless prairie. In the morning, the sun shone warmly. Down by the creek, the frogs were croaking. Grump, grump, they cried by the edge of the pools. Knee deep, better go around. Knee deep, better go around. Ever since Ma had told them what the frogs were saying, Mary and Laura could hear the words plainly. The door was open to let the warm spring air. After breakfast, Pa went out whistling merrily. He was going to hitch Pet and Patty to the plow again, but his whistling suddenly stopped. He stood on the doorstep looking toward the east, and he said, "Come here, Caroline. And you, Mary and Laura." Sorry, folks. This is actually a really hard chapter for me to read. Laura ran out first, and she was surprised. The Indians were coming. They did not come on the creek road. They came riding up out of the creek bottoms far to the east. The first came the tall Indian who had gone riding by the house in the moonlight. Jack was growling, and Laura's heart beat fast. She was glad to be close to Pa, but she knew this was the good Indian, the Osage chief who had stopped the terrible war cries. His black pony came trotting willingly, sniffing the wind that blew its mane and tail like fluttering banners. They even rode them without any bridle or any restraints. You know what I mean? Sniffing the wind that blew its mane and tail like fluttering banners. The pony's nose and head were free. It wore no bridle. Not even one strap was on it anywhere. There was nothing to make it do anything it didn't want to do. Willingly, it came trotting along the old Indian trail as if it liked to carry the Indian on its back. Jack growled savagely, trying to get loose from his chain. He remembered this Indian who had pointed a gun at him, and Pa said, "Be still, Jack." Jack growled again, and for the first time in their lives, Pa struck him. "Lie down and be still," Pa said. Jack cowered down and down still, and was still. The pony was very near now, and Laura's heart beat faster and faster. She looked at the Indian's beaded moccasin. She looked up along the fringed legging that clung to the pony's bare side. A bright colored blanket was wrapped around the Indian. One bare brown arm carried a rifle lightly across the pony's naked shoulders. Then Laura looked up at the Indian's fierce, still brown face. It was a proud, still face. No matter what happened, it would always be like that. Nothing would change it. Only the eyes were alive in that face, and they gazed steadily far away to the west. They did not move. Nothing moved or changed except the eagle feathers standing straight up from the scalp block on the shaved head. The long feathers swayed and dipped, waving and spinning in the wind as the tall Indian on the black pony passed on into the distance. Duchesne himself, said Pa under his breath, and he lifted his hand in salute. But the happy pony and the motionless Indian went by. They went by as if the house and stable, Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura were not there at all. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura slowly turned and looked at the Indian's proud straight back. Then other ponies and other blankets and shaved heads and eagle feathers came by. One by one, on the path, more and more savage warriors were riding behind Duchesne. Brown face after brown face went by. Ponies' manes and tails blew in the wind. Beads glittered, fringes flapped. Eagle feathers were waving on all the naked heads. Rifles lying on ponies' shoulders bristled all along the line. Laura was excited to see the ponies. There were black ponies and bay ponies and gray and brown and spotted ponies. Their little feet went trippity-trip, pitter-patter, trippity pitter-patter, all along the Indian trail. Their noses widened at Jack and their bodies shied away from him, but they came on bravely, looking with bright eyes at Laura. "Oh, the pretty ponies! See the pretty ponies!" she cried, clapping her hands. That sounds more like a toddler, eh? Look at the spotted one. She thought she would never be tired of watching those ponies coming by. But after a while, she began to look at the women and the children on their backs. The women and children came riding behind the Indian men. Little naked brown Indians, no bigger than Mary and Laura, were riding pretty ponies. The ponies did not have to wear bridles or saddles, and the little Indians did not have to wear clothes. All their skin was out in the fresh air and the sunshine. Their straight black hair blew in the wind, and their black eyes sparkled with joy. They sat on their ponies stiff and still like the grown-up Indians. Laura looked and looked at the Indian children, and they looked at her. She had a naughty wish to be a little Indian girl. Why was it naughty? Because they were free and naked? Of course, she did not really mean it. Oh, be a little Indian girl. Of course, she did not mean it. She only wanted to be bare naked in the wind and the sunshine and riding one of those gay little ponies. The Indians' children's mothers were riding ponies too. Leather fringe dangled around their legs and blankets were wrapped around their bodies, but the only thing on their heads was their black, smooth hair. Their faces were brown and placid. Some had narrow bundles tied on their backs, and tiny babies' heads stuck out of the tops of the bundles. And some babies and some small children rode in baskets hanging at the pony's side beside their mother. More and more ponies passed, and more children and more babies on their mothers' backs, and more babies in baskets on pony sides. Then came a mother riding with a baby in a basket on each side of her pony. Laura looked straight into the bright eyes of the little baby nearer her. Only its small head showed above the basket's rim. Its hair was as black as a crow's, and its eyes were black as night when no stars shine. Those black eyes looked deep into Laura's eyes, and she looked deep down into the blackness of the little baby's eyes, and she wanted that one little baby. "Pa," she said, "get me that little baby." "Hush, Laura," Pa told her sternly. The little baby was going by. Its head turned and its eyes kept looking into Laura's. I want it. I want it, Laura begged. The baby, as if it was a doll, The baby was going farther and farther away, but it did not stop looking at Laura. It wants to stay with me, Laura begged. Please, Pa, please. Hush, Laura, Pa said. The Indian woman wants to keep her baby. Oh, Pa, Laura pleaded, and then she began to cry. It was shameful to cry, but she couldn't help it. The little Indian baby was gone. She knew she would never see it anymore. Ma said she'd never heard of such a thing. For shame, Laura. I don't always like Ma. For shame, Laura, she said, but Laura could not stop crying. Why on earth do you want an Indian baby of all things? Ma asked. Its eyes were so black, Laura sobbed. She could not say what she meant. Why, Laura, Ma said, you don't want another baby. We have a baby of our own. I want the other one too, Laura sobbed loudly. Well, I declare, Ma exclaimed. Look at the Indians, Laura, Pa said. Look west and then look east and see what you see. Laura could hardly see at first. Her eyes were so full of tears and sobs kept jerking out of her throat. But she obeyed Pa as best she could, and in a moment she was still. As far as she could see to the west, and as far as she could see to the east, were the Indians. There was no end to that long, long, long line. That's an awful lot of Indians, Pa said. More and more Indians came riding by. Baby Carrie grew tired of looking at Indians and played by herself on the floor. But Laura sat on the doorstep. Pa stood close by her, and Ma and Mary stood in the doorway. Laura sat on the doorstep. Pa stood close by, and Ma and Mary stood in the doorway. They looked and looked and looked at the Indians riding by. It was dinner time, and no one thought of dinner. Indian ponies were still going by, carrying bundles of skins and tent poles and dangling baskets and cooking pots. There were a few more women and a few more naked children. Then the very last pony went by. But Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary still stayed in the doorway looking till that long line of Indians slowly pulled itself over the western edge of the world. And nothing was left but silence and emptiness. All the world seemed very quiet and lonely. Ma said she didn't feel like doing anything. She was so let down. Pa told her not to do anything but rest. You must eat something, Charles, Ma said. No, said Pa, I don't feel hungry. He went soberly to hitch up Pet and Patty, and he began to break the tough sod with the plow. Laura could not eat anything either. She sat a long time on the doorstep looking into the empty west where the Indians had gone. She seemed still to see waving feathers and black eyes and to hear the sound of the pony's feet. Excuse me. Okay. Are we still here? Am I still here? Now, we have 2 chapters left. And they're not that long. Do you want me to continue reading? I'm going to take a general consensus because I'm not going to sit here reading if nobody wants me to. All right. Okay. Chapter 25. Soldiers. After the Indians had gone, A great peace settled on the prairie, and one morning the whole land was green. When did that grass grow? Ma asked in amazement. I thought the whole country was black, and now there's nothing but green grass as far as the eye can see. The whole sky was filled with lines of wild ducks and wild geese flying north. Crows cawed above the trees along the creek. The winds whispered in the new grass, bringing scents of earth and growing things. In the mornings, the meadowlarks rose singing into the sky. All day, the curlews and killdeers and sandpipers chirped and sang in the creek bottoms. Often in the early evening, the mockingbirds were singing. One night, Pa and Mary and Laura sat still on the doorstep, watching the little rabbits playing in the grass in the starlight. That's okay, Alexis. You can rewatch the when we're done. It's a long one today. We're finishing the book. Three rabbit mothers hopped about with lopping ears and watched their little baby rabbits playing too. In the daytime, everyone was busy. Pa hurried with his plowing, and Mary and Laura helped Ma plant the early garden seeds. With the hoe, Ma dug holes in the matted grass roots that the plow had turned up, and Laura and Mary carefully dropped the seeds. When Ma covered them snugly with earth, covered them snugly with earth. They planted onions and carrots and peas and beans and turnips. They were all so happy because spring had come. And pretty soon they would have vegetables to eat. They were growing very tired of just bread and meat. One evening, Pa came from the field before sunset, and he helped Ma set out the cabbage plants and the sweet potato plants. Ma had sowed the cabbage seeds in a flat box and kept it in the house. She watered it carefully and carried it every day from the morning sunshine to the afternoon sunshine that came through the windows. And she saved one of the Christmas sweet potatoes and planted it in another box. The cabbage seeds were now little gray-green plants, and the sweet potatoes had sent up a stem and green leaves from every one of its eyes. Pa and Ma took each tiny plant very carefully and settled its roots comfortably in the holes made for them. They watered the roots and pressed earth upon them firmly. It was dark before the last plant was in its place. Yeah, I'm going to be going out shortly and tearing up weeds out of beds between now and my next live. They watered the roots and pressed earth upon them firmly. It was dark before the last plant was in its place. Pa and Ma were tired, but they were glad too, because this year they'd have cabbages and sweet potatoes. Every day they all looked at that garden. It was rough and grassy because it was made in the prairie sod, but all the tiny plants were growing. Little crumpled leaves of peas came up and tiny spears of onions. The beans themselves popped out of the ground, but it was a little yellow bean stem coiled like a spring that pushed them up. Then the bean was cracked open and dropped by two baby leaves, and the leaves unfolded flat to the sunshine. Pretty soon they would all begin to live like kings. Every morning, Pa went cheerfully whistling to the field. He planted some early sod potatoes, and some potatoes were saved to plant later. Now he carried a sack of corn fastened to his belt, and as he plowed, he threw grains of corn into the furrow beside the plow's point. The plow turned over a strip of sod on top of the seed corn, but the corn would fight its way up through the matted grass roots, and there would be a cornfield. There would be green corn for dinner someday, and next winter there would be ripe corn for Pet and Patty to eat. Sorry, animals, ruminants like horses, goats, and cows and stuff, they should not eat corn. It's really bad for them. One morning, Mary and Laura, why didn't he buy oats? Because I guess oats, corn could have doubled. They could have eat corn if they needed to, right? One morning, Mary and Laura were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the beds. She was humming softly to herself, and Laura and Mary were talking about the garden. Laura liked peas best, and Mary liked beans. Suddenly, they heard Pa's voice, loud and angry. Ma went quickly to the door, and Laura and Mary peeped out on either side of her. Pa was driving Pet and Patty from the field, dragging the plow behind them. Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards were with Pa, and Mr. Scott was talking earnestly. No, Scott, Pa answered him. I'll not stay here to be taken away by soldiers like an outlaw. If some blasted politicians in Washington hadn't sent out word it would be right to settle here, I'd never have been 3 miles over the line in Indian territory. Only 3 miles. But I'll not wait for the soldiers to take us out. We're going now. What is the matter, Charles? Where are we going? Ma asked. Derned if I know, but we're going. We're leaving here, Pa said. I'd have killed him. Scott and Edwards say the government is sending soldiers to take all us settlers out of Indian territory. His face was very red and his eyes were like blue fire. Laura was frightened. She had never seen Pa look like that. She pressed close against Ma and was still looking at Pa. Mr. Scott started to speak, but Pa stopped him. Save your breath, Scott. It's no use to say another word. He's just an excuse to move on, right? You can stay till the soldiers come if you want to. I'm going now. Mr. Edwards said he was going too. He would not stay to be driven across the line like an ornery yellow hound. Ride out to Independence with us, Edwards, Pa said. But Mr. Edwards answered he didn't care to go north. He would make a boat and go on down the rivers to some settlement farther south. Better come with us, Pa urged him, and go down on foot through Missouri. It's a risky trip, one man alone in a boat going down the Verdigris among the wild Indian tribes. But Mr. Edwards said that he had already seen Missouri, and he had plenty of powder and lead. Then Pa told Mr. Scott to take the cow and calf. We can't take them with us, Pa said. You've been a good neighbor, Scott, and I'm sorry to leave you, but we're going out in the morning. Now, if they're going to travel all that way, why wouldn't they just hitch the cow and the calf to the back of the wagon? It's not like they were going to run, right? It's not like they were going to pull the wagons at a high rate of speed. Laura heard all of this, but she had not believed it until she saw Mr. Scott leading away the cow. The gentle cow went meekly away with the rope around her long horns, and the calf frisked and jumped behind. There went all the milk and butter. Mr. Edwards said he would be too busy to see them again. He shook his hands with Pa, saying, Goodbye, Ingalls, and good luck. He shook hands with Ma and said, Goodbye, ma'am. I won't be seeing you all again, but I sure will never forget your kindness. Then he turned to Mary and Laura, and he shook their hands as if they were grown-ups. Goodbye, he said. Mary said politely, Goodbye, Mr. Edwards. But Laura forgot to be polite, and she said, Oh, Mr. Edwards, I wish you wouldn't go away. Oh, Mr. Edwards, thank you for going all the way to Independence to find Santa Claus for us. Mr. Edwards' eyes shone bright, very bright, and he went away without saying another word. Pa began to unhitch Pet and Patty in the middle of the morning, and Laura and Mary knew it was true. They were really going away from there. Ma didn't say anything. She went into the house and looked around at the dishes not washed and the bed only partly made, and she lifted up both hands and sat down. I don't blame her. Mary and Laura went on doing the dishes. They were careful not to let them make a sound. They turned around quickly when Pa came in. He looked like himself again, and he was carrying the potato sack. Here we are, Caroline, he said, and his voice sounded natural. Cook plenty of dinner. We've been going without potatoes, saving them for seed. Now we'll eat them up. So that day for dinner, they ate the seed potatoes. They were very good, and Laura knew that Pa was right when he said there's no great loss without some small gain. Yeah, me too, Jean, right? After dinner, he took the wagon bows from their pegs in the barn. He put them on the wagon and one end of each bow in its iron strap on the other side of the wagon box, and the other end in its iron strap on the other side. When all the bows were standing up in their places, Pa and Ma spread the wagon cover over them and tied it down tightly. Then Pa pulled the rope in the end of the wagon over it till it puckered together and left only a tiny round hole in the middle of the back. There stood the covered wagon, all ready to load in the morning. Everyone was quiet that night. Even Jack felt that something was wrong. He lay close to Laura when she went to bed. It was now too warm for a fire, but Pa and Ma sat looking at the ashes in the fireplace. Ma sighed and said gently, "A whole year gone, Charles." But Pa answered cheerfully, "What's a year amount to? We've all the time there is." Talk about an itchy foot. We have one chapter left. Let me just have a sip of tea. Look at the dust. All right. Are we ready for the final chapter of Little House on the Prairie? I would have kept them too, right? Because it's not like you're going to go very far, or like you're going to go far, but you're not going to go fast, right? Because you can't go any faster without hurting or wearing out the horses. So why wouldn't you just tie the cow and its calf, or give the calf away and tie the cow on the back and then just let it follow you home? Milk it every day. Like, sheesh. Chapter 6, going out. Chapter 26, I mean. After breakfast the next morning, Pa and Ma packed the wagon. First, all the bedding was made into 2 beds and laid on top of each other in the back of the wagon and carefully covered with a pretty plaid blanket. Mary and Laura and baby Carrie would ride there in the daytime. At night, the top bed would be put in the front of the wagon for Pa to sleep in, and Laura and Mary would sleep in the bottom bed, where it was. Next, Pa took the small cupboard from the wall, and in it Ma packed all the food and dishes. Pa put the cupboard under the wagon seat, and in front of it he laid a sack of corn for the horses. "It'll make a good rest for our feet, Caroline," he said to Ma. Ma packed all the clothing into 2 carpet bags. Can you imagine packing clothing for 5 people into 2 suitcases? And Pa hung them on the wagon bows inside the wagon. Opposite them, he hung his rifle in its straps, and his bullet pouch and powder horn hung beneath it. His fiddle in its box lay on one end of the bed where it would ride softly. Ma wrapped the big iron spider, the bake oven, and the coffee pot in sacks and put them in the wagon, while Pa tied the rocking chair and the tub outside and hung the water bucket and the horse bucket underneath. And he put the tin lantern carefully in the front corner of the wagon box where the sack of corn held it still. Now the wagon was loaded. The only thing they could not take was the plow. Well, that could not be helped. There was no room for it. The plow and the cow. Those are 2 things I would have kept. When they came to wherever they were going, Pa could get more furs to trade for another plow. Laura and Mary climbed into the wagon and sat on the bed in the back. Ma put baby Carrie between them. They were all freshly washed and combed. Pa said they were clean as a hound's tooth, and Ma told him they were bright as new pins. Then Pa hitched Pet and Patty to the wagon. Ma climbed to her place on the seat and held the lines. Suddenly, Laura wanted to see the house again. She asked Pa to please let her look out. So he loosened the rope in the back of the wagon cover that made a large round hole. Laura and Mary could look out, but still the rope held up enough of the canvas to keep Carrie from tumbling into the feed box. The snug log house looked just as it always had. It did not seem to know they were going away. Pa stood a moment in the doorway and looked all around inside. He looked at the bedstead and the fireplace and the glass windows. Then he closed the door carefully, leaving the latch string out. Somebody might need shelter, he said. He climbed to his place beside Ma, gathered the reins into his hands, and chirruped to Pet and Patty. Jack went under the wagon. Pet whinnied to Bunny, who came to walk beside her, and they were off. Just before the creek road went down into the bottoms, Pa stopped the Mustangs, and they all looked back. As far as they could see, to the east and to the south and to the west, nothing was moving in all the vastness of the high prairie. Only the green grass was rippling in the wind, and white clouds drifted in the high, clear sky. "It's a great country, Caroline," he said, "but there will be wild Indians and wolves here for many a long day." The little log house and the little stable sat lonely in the stillness. Excuse me. My legs get tired. Then Pet and Patty briskly started onward. The wagon went down from the bluffs into the wooded creek bottoms, and high up in a treetop a mockingbird began to sing. "I never heard of a mockingbird sing so early," said Ma, and Pa answered softly, "He's telling us goodbye." They rode down through the low hills to the creek. The ford was low, an easy crossing. On they went across the bottoms, where antlered deer stood to watch them passing, and mother deer with their fawns bounded into the shadows of the woods. And up between the steep, red earth cliffs, the wagon climbed to the prairie again. Pet and Patty were eager to go. Their hoofs made a muffled sound in the bottoms, but now they rang on the hard prairie, and the wind sang shrill against the foremost wagon bows. Pa and Ma were still and silent on the wagon seat, and Mary and Laura were quiet too. But Laura felt all excited inside. You never know what will happen next, nor where you'll be tomorrow when you're traveling in a covered wagon. I think sounds like she got a bit at Pa's itch. At noon, Pa stopped beside a little spring to let the Mustangs eat and drink and rest. The spring would soon be dry in the summer's heat, but there was plenty of water now. Ma took cold cornbread and meat from the food box, and they all ate sitting on the clean grass in the shade of the wagon. They drank from the spring, and Laura and Mary ran around in the grass picking wildflowers while Ma tidied the food box and Pa hitched up Pet and Patty again. For a long time they went on. Across the prairie, there was nothing to be seen but blowing grass, the sky, and the endless wagon track. Now and then a rabbit bounded away. Sometimes a prairie hen with her brood of baby chicks scuttled out of sight in the grass. Baby Carrie slept. Mary and Laura were almost asleep when they heard Pa say, "Something's wrong there." Laura jumped up, and far ahead on the prairie she saw a small light-colored bump. She couldn't see anything else unusual. "Where?" she asked Pa. "There," said Pa, toward that bump, nodding toward that bump. "It isn't moving." Laura didn't say any more. She kept on looking, and she saw that the bump was a covered wagon. Slowly it grew bigger. She saw that no horses were hitched to it. Nothing moved anywhere around it. Then she saw something dark in front of it. The dark thing was two people sitting on the wagon tongue. They were a man and woman. They sat looking down at their feet, and they moved only their heads to look up when Pet and Patty stopped in front of them. "What's wrong? Where are your horses?" Pa asked. "I don't know," said the man. I tied them to the wagon last night. This morning they were gone. Somebody's cut the ropes and took them away in the night." "What about your dog?" "I haven't got a dog." Jack stayed under the wagon. He didn't growl, but he didn't come out. He was a sensible dog and knew what to do when he met strangers, unless they were Indians, apparently. Well, your horses are gone, Pa told the man. You'll never see them again. Hanging's too good for horse thieves. Yep, said the man. Pa looked at Ma and barely nodded. Then Pa said, come ride with us to Independence. No, said the man. All we've got is in this wagon, and we won't leave it. Why, man, what'll you do? Pa exclaimed. There may be nobody along here for days, weeks. You can't stay here. I don't know, said the man. We'll stay with our wagon, the woman said. She was looking down at her hands clasped in her lap, and Laura couldn't see her face. She could only see the side of her sunbonnet. Better to come, Pa told them. You can come back for your wagon. No, said the woman. They wouldn't leave the wagon. Everything they owned in the world was in it. So at last Pa drove on, leaving them sitting on the wagon tongue all alone on the prairie. Pa muttered to himself, tenderfeet, everything they own and no dog to watch it. Didn't keep watch himself and tied his horses with ropes, Pa snorted. Tenderfeet, he said again. Shouldn't be allowed loose west of the Mississippi. But Charles, what'll ever become of them? Ma asked. There are soldiers at Independence, said Pa. I'll tell the captain and he'll send out men to bring them in. Then they can hold out that long, but it's darn lucky for them we came by. If we hadn't, there's no telling when they would have been found. Laura watched that lonely wagon until it was only a small lump on the prairie. Then it was a speck. Then it was gone. All the rest of the day, Pa drove on and on. They didn't see anybody else. When the sun was setting, Pa stopped by a well. A house had once been there, but it was burned. The well had plenty of good water, and Laura and Mary gathered bits of half-burned wood to make the fire, while Pa unhitched and watered the horses and put them on picket lines. Then Pa took the seat down from the wagon and lifted out the food box. The fire burned beautifully, and Ma quickly got supper. Everything was just as it used to be before they built the house. Pa and Ma and Carrie were on the wagon seat. Laura and Mary sat on top of the wagon tongue. They ate the good supper, hot from the campfire. Petty and Patty and Bunny munched the good grass, and Laura saved bits for Jack, who mustn't beg but could eat his fill as soon as supper was over. The sun went down far away in the west, and it was time to make the camp ready for night. Pa chained Pet and Patty to the feed box at the end of the wagon. He chained Bunny to the side, and he fed them all their supper of corn. Then he sat by the fire and smoked his pipe. See, the thing is with eating corn, they're still getting a lot of grass and hay, which will help get rid of the toxic flora and fauna in their gut that corn would cause, right? Ma tucked Mary and Laura into bed and laid baby Carrie beside them. She sat down beside Pa at the fire, and Pa took his fiddle out of the box and began to play. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. The fiddle wailed, and Pa began to sing. I went to California with my washpan on my knee, and every time I thought of home, I wished it wasn't me. Do you know, Caroline, Pa stopped singing to say, I've been thinking what fun the rabbits will have eating that garden we planted. Don't, Charles. Never mind, Caroline, Pa told her. We'll make a better garden. Anyway, we're taking more out of Indian Territory than we took in. I don't know what, Ma said, and Pa answered, Why, there's the little mule. Then Ma laughed, and Pa and the fiddle sang again. In Dixieland, I'll take my stand and live and die in Dixie, away, 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 away down south in Dixie. They sang with a lilt and a swing that almost lifted Laura right out of bed. She must lie still and not wake Carrie. Mary was sleeping too, but Laura had never been wider awake. She heard Jack making his bed under the wagon. He was turning round and round, trampling down the grass. When he curled into that round nest with a flop and a sigh of satisfaction. Pet and Patty were munching the last of their corn, and their chains rattled. Bunny lay down beside the wagon. They were all together, safe and comfortable for the night, under the wide starlit sky. Once more the covered wagon was a home. The fiddle began to play a marching tune, and Pa's clear voice was singing like a deep-toned bell. And we'll rally round the flag, boys. We'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Laura felt that she must shout, too, but softly Ma looked in through the round hole in the wagon cover. Charles, Ma said, Laura is wide awake. She can't go to sleep on such music as that. Pa didn't answer, but the voice of the fiddle changed. Softly and slurringly it began a long, swinging rhythm that seemed to rock Laura gently. She felt her eyelids closing, began to drift over the endless waves of prairie grasses, and Pa's voice went with her, singing, Row away, row o'er the water so blue, like a feather we sail in our gum tree canoe. Row the boat lightly, love over the sea, daily and highly I'll wander with thee. And that is the last page of Little House on the Prairie. I think the big woods of Wisconsin, Joseph Grant says, Pa had it great there in the big woods of Wisconsin. My family and I are making it just fine. Well, Pa had an itchy foot, and he wanted privacy. He didn't want to hear somebody else's arguments or somebody else's axe or somebody else's gun. People got too close. He moved on. That's just the way it was. But yeah, they had it right. They had it good. But if you think about it, their little cabin that they had in the big woods was really tiny. It was like not much bigger than this room. It had an attic above. It had, well, it was probably twice the size of this room, right? Now they have to build another house. Yeah, that's true. Well, folks, next week we will start. We're going to take a break from Little House Live. And next week, we're going to start reading Sarah Sparks' new story live. Now, are you sure you want it live over it? The problem is it's getting under the point where it's going to be hard for me to record books or stories because I'm going to have fans on and winds open and pool pumps running and all that stuff. So I still have to work on Anne of Windy Poplars, which I've only got, I think, like 10 chapters left. And that book is done. And then when we do this, we'll be done pretty much for the season of live reading, okay? I've been in it many times. How big was it, Joseph? How big was it? Because this room is about 10 by 12, this room. Yes, live, please. Okay. Well, listen, I'm going to, now that it's nice and cool, now the sun's shining, but it's nice and cool, I'm going to go out and try and dig some weeds out of my garden, so that it can be ready for to put we're going to put landscape fabric down, because some of my beds never got only filled half full last year, right? So they have to be topped up, but they're full of weeds. So I'm going to go and rake out the weeds and tack down some landscape fabric, and then Howie's going to fill the boxes tomorrow and we'll plant them. 2 rooms and a loft, 12 by 16 maybe. Yeah. Well, this here is 10 by 12. So you might want to like double the size of this room. Probably like my bedroom. Oh no, my bedroom's not that big. Anyway, 90 degrees in Massachusetts for the first time. Of course he was selfish to keep moving the family, but he wouldn't have done it if his wife didn't agree, right? It's kind of like, I don't know. Anyway, I have been here for an hour and a half. So we will see you next week on Saturday, 4 p.m. for Grandy's Gift. And you know what? I might read the whole book. And you know what? I didn't notice. This is the first book Sarah sent me Then she sent the 4 to give away. I didn't see it until today or till yesterday. She signed it. She signed it for me. So we'll see you next Saturday, 4 p.m. for the reading of, we might even go earlier. We might even go 3. Everyone stay safe and cool. And we will see you next week for the live reading of Grandy's gift. This is Bev from Reading with Beverly Wolfe saying, I have to go pull some weeds, tack down some stuff, and then come back for my live at 4 o'clock on Life with the Wolfies. And if you don't know where Life with the Wolfies is, I'm going to get it for you right here, right now. Just give me a second and I'll put the link in to the chat. Switch down. I'm at 852 subscribers on the new channel. Oh no, I'm doing the wrong one here. I've got 852 subscribers. So as soon as I hit 1,050, I'm going to be doing that gift card giveaway. There's also the fact that before I can monetize that channel, I have to have 4,000 watch time hours, which I don't have enough stuff for on that. So anyway, I got to open my window because I'm getting hot now. Daddy's got all my plants outside. Oh yeah, and that's another thing. They're doing a lot of construction next door. The new people have bought it. They're just clearing everything. They're tearing down old sheds and campers that had been turned into chicken coops and there was 100-some acres, and that guy had stuff planted all over built half-assed all over the place. So they're working on it. Anyway, take care. I love you guys. We'll see you next Saturday, unless I see you at 4 o'clock over on Life with the Wolfies. All right. I love you guys. Take care. God bless.